So clean architecture, unlike the layered architecture, puts the business logic in the center. So if you're not familiar with the term domain, then you can imagine the domain and the application, both of these together, compose the business logic like in the three-tier architecture. So here's another way to look at the clean architecture. This way it's more similar to the layered architecture that we looked at before. So the application and the domain layer both compose the business logic of the application. Then we have the presentation layer, which is very similar to the presentation layer that we saw before, where it interacts with the client or the user. Then we have the infrastructure, which is responsible for multiple things, and one of them is interacting with the database. Like you can see, all the dependencies point towards the core of the application, which is the application and the domain layers. And this means we can go ahead and implement the domain and the application layers without taking into account the presentation and the infrastructure technologies or frameworks. Now, if we put this next to the layered architecture, then we can see that unlike everything pointing to the database, then we have everything pointing towards the core. Going back to what we said, where we have a domain-centric architecture that puts the domain in the center. If you're curious, how can it be that the core of the application is created independently from the data access logic? Because of course, over here, this makes sense that the business logic needs to use the database. So it has a dependency on the data access layer. How does this work over here? Because at some point, we'll need to access the database. So we'll cover this in depth in the course, but just a quick answer if you're curious is that we'll go ahead and define interfaces in the application layer and in the domain layer. And these layers will interact with this interface without caring about how it's implemented. And the implementation itself will sit in the infrastructure layer, where this can be swapped and replaced with other implementations, whether it's for unit testing or as the application grows, we do some refactor and we change the underlying technology or framework. So I put over here a summary of what clean architecture is, where basically it separates the software into layers with a dependency rule that layers only point inwards. Inner layers contain the business logic, and outer layers contain infrastructure and interaction with the outer world. Also, like we said, inner layers define interfaces and outer layers define the implementation to these interfaces. Now, if this still sounds pretty abstract and you don't know what kind of logic sits in each place, then don't worry, we'll cover this step by step. And by the end of this course, you'll not only know what sits in each layer, but you'll also have an intuition to look at a piece of logic and know intuitively if it needs to sit in a specific layer or in a different layer. So let's do a quick recap of this section and then let's jump right in, see what project we're going to build, and get our hands dirty and start writing some code. So this section was a soft introduction to software architecture. We saw how software architecture is basically how we structure our code base and how there are specific architectural patterns that we can use to solve commonly occurring problems in software architecture. We then talked about layered architecture and why it's a bit problematic that all the dependencies are towards the database, and why domain-centric architectures may be a better suited solution if you want to put the business logic in the center. Then we talked about clean architecture, which is a specific domain-centric architecture, very similar to onion architecture and hexagonal architecture, which puts the business logic in two layers called the domain and the application layers, and how we're able to take the infrastructure and the presentation and put them above these layers by defining interfaces in the inner layers and having their implementation sit in outer layers. Now that we have that knowledge, let's go ahead and talk about the project that we'll be exploring in this course. The domain that we'll be exploring in this course is DomeGym. DomeGym is a gym session scheduling system. So you can imagine in the gym close to your house, there are various sessions like Zumba, functional, yoga, etc. and you can go into a specific system and book a spot or reserve a spot in one of these sessions. Then you can take a look at all the sessions that you have going on and see when they are, what room they're taking place in, etc. So here I created some mock-up of this application. So let's imagine that this is the homepage where, as you can see, we have the upcoming sessions. So over here, we're logged in as Lior, my wife, and you can see the sessions that you have upcoming, and you can click on one of them and see an awkward picture of me trying to be strong, and you have an option to cancel the reservation if you want. Again, these are mock-ups just for you to have an easier time to imagine what we're going to be building. Then you can go ahead and browse the sessions that exist. So you can go to a specific date, choose the types of sessions that you want, and again, you can click one of them, see the details, and you can reserve a spot to this session. Then you have the profile page where you can update some settings, maybe edit your profile, sign out, etc. Now, this is all from the point of view of a participant. So if you're a participant and you want to reserve a spot in a session, then that's how you would do it from the participant point of view. I want us to look specifically, because this will be the focus of this course, on the point of view of the admin. So let's imagine that you're a gym owner and you want to go ahead and use this software. So the way it looks is the following. So you have your home page. This time, instead of being your upcoming sessions, then you have the gyms that you have created. So over here, you can see the gyms that you have in your subscription, and you can go ahead and see an overview of how many participants you have in the gym, trainers, weekly sessions, perhaps how many rooms you have in the gym. And then you have some actions like adding a new room, adding a new trainer, or editing some of the details of the gym. And finally, you can go ahead and create a new gym if you want. If you click the sessions button, then it takes you to the sessions where you can not only see the various sessions, this time you have the option to also look at the various gyms that you own, but you can also create new sessions or update existing sessions. Then in the profile, then very similar, but over here we also have an option to switch profiles to a participant profile. Okay, so this is the application that we're building. I want us to look at it specifically from the admin point of view, because we'll be building the gym management system, which will be responsible for creating these subscriptions, creating these gyms, and doing the actions that we talked about. Finally, we have various subscription types. So in the free subscription type, then you can go ahead and create one gym, and inside that one gym, create one room. And inside that one room, you can go ahead and create up to 4 daily sessions. If you want more than that, then you need to go ahead and upgrade to one of the other subscriptions. So you can pay $19, and then you have 3 rooms instead of 1, and unlimited daily sessions instead of 4. If you want even more, then you can go ahead and upgrade it to the Pro, where you have 3 gyms and unlimited rooms and unlimited daily sessions. Now, this domain is purposely complex because it is what we built in the Getting Started with Domain-Driven Design course. So we wanted a domain with a lot of business rules and a lot of constraints. But in this course, the focus is on the structure itself. That's why we're taking one of the simpler applications, which is the gym management application, and we'll build it in a step-by-step fashion. So don't worry if this was a bit overwhelming, because the focus of this course is not the domain and the business rules, but it's the structure around it following clean architecture. So now let's talk about the project that we're going to build and a bit about how this course is built. The project that we'll be building, like we said, is Dome Gym. And like we said, we'll focus specifically on the gym management context, which will be responsible for creating a subscription, deleting a subscription, creating a gym, deleting a gym, and also adding rooms, deleting rooms, and adding trainers to the gym. This is in the gym management context. If you want to book sessions, reserve spots in sessions, create sessions, etc., all this happens in the session reservations application. If you want to create new profiles, this happens in the user management context. If you want anything that has to do with billing, then that happens in the billing application. Okay, so again, the focus is only the gym management context. The actual application that we'll have by the end of this course will look like this. Now, I'm not zooming in because we'll zoom in across the entire course. But what I want you to notice at this stage is that all we're doing is we're taking all the various files and folders and we're splitting them up across the different logical components that clean architecture lays out. So in clean architecture, we have the 4 layers that we talked about up until now. And in the end, what we have is the code is scattered across these layers where each section has a specific part of the application. Now, it's important to note that once you're familiar with clean architecture, you'll go ahead and build the application starting from the domain layer. That said, I don't think that's the easiest way to learn clean architecture if you're not familiar with clean architecture already. What we're going to do in this course is what I think is a better approach for teaching clean architecture, which is looking at it from the chronological order of an actual request. So if you're sending a request to a backend server, or if you're a user interacting with some user interface, you're first interacting with the presentation layer, then with the application layer, and only then with the domain layer. That's why in this course, we'll first talk about the presentation layer, then we'll talk about the application layer, and then about the domain layer. So with all of that out of the way, let's jump right in and start setting up our project following clean architecture. Okay, so let's go ahead and create the projects corresponding to the clean architecture layers that we talked about before. I'll zoom in so we can see something. What we're going to do is, because again, we're building a web API or a backend application where the presentation layer technology or framework is ASP.NET, and we're interacting with the client via REST and HTTP. So for us, the presentation layer is composed of the controllers. This is why this over here is a web API, but all the other projects are simply class libraries. So for this, let's say .NET New, and let's say web API, and yes, let's just fix the typo and create the project as so. Next, let's go ahead and create the application project. So let's say .NET New, and let's say ClassLib gym management.application. Same thing, let's say infrastructure, and finally for the domain as well. Okay, so currently what we have is we have the 4 projects corresponding to the 4 layers that we have in clean architecture, where all the projects are simply class libraries other than the API project, because this is the host of the application and we're working with ASP.NET, then this is the only one which is a web API. The next thing I want to do is I want to add the reference between the projects corresponding to the layer dependency that we talked about. So like we said, there is a layer dependency between the presentation layer and the application layer, which is why we're going to introduce a project dependency between the gym management.api project to the gym management.application project. So for this, let's say .NET add, and we want to add to the API project a reference to the gym management.application project. Next, let's do the same thing, but let's add a reference from the infrastructure project to the application project. This corresponds to this line over here and creates a dependency between these 2 projects. And finally, let's create a reference from the application project to the domain project. So again, this corresponds to this line over here. Great, now that we have all of our projects, let's go ahead and create the actual solution. So let's say .NET New SLN, and let's give it the name Gym Management. And let's go ahead and add all the projects to this solution. So I'll say .NET SLN add, and let's specify it like this. Now, because I'm working on macOS, then this command works. It works also on Linux, but if you're working on Windows, then you'll need to say something like this for it to add all the projects. So this adds all the various projects. Now we can say .NET build, and the project should build successfully. Great, so we have all that set up. Let's cover briefly what we'll be using to send and receive HTTP requests in this course. And then let's go ahead and dive into the presentation layer and start implementing the controller.